My father didn't come to my wedding, not because he was late, not because something came up, not because he forgot. 3 days after I walked down that aisle without him, he was dead. For 5 years, I believed I understood exactly why he never showed up. I had an explanation I held onto like something sharp, painful to grip, but impossible to let go of. I was wrong. I was so completely, catastrophically wrong. And I didn't find out until a water-stained cardboard box arrived at my door on a Tuesday afternoon, 14 months after we buried him. I need to tell you this from the beginning, because none of it makes sense out of order. And I've spent a long time trying to figure out how to say it, how to do justice to a man I thought I knew, a man I was furious at, a man I grieved, and a man I'm only now beginning to understand. His name was Gerald, but everyone who loved him called him Jerry. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone's business is everyone's business, and the diner on Main Street has been run by the same family for 40 years. My parents divorced when I was 9. My mother moved us, me and my younger brother Danny, into a smaller house on the other side of town, and my father stayed in the house we grew up in. It wasn't a bitter divorce. That always surprised people when I said it. There were no screaming matches, no lawyers fighting over assets, no one throwing dishes. My parents simply became two people who were better apart than together. My mother told me once, years later, that they had run out of things to say to each other. Not in a sad way, she said, just quietly, like a candle burning down. So my father was still in our lives, every other weekend, summer vacations. He came to school plays and soccer games and sat 3 rows behind my mother and nodded at her politely when she caught his eye. He called every Sunday night at 7, not 7:15, not 6:50, 7 o'clock, like clockwork, for years. I loved him with the uncomplicated love a child has before life makes things complicated. He was quiet, thoughtful. He fixed things, actual things, like broken hinges and leaky faucets, but also problems. He had this way of listening that made you feel like your problem was the only thing in the world that mattered right then. He didn't offer advice unless you asked. He just listened. And then he'd say something measured and true that stuck with you for weeks. He wasn't perfect. He drank too much through my teenage years, not falling down drunk, but a quiet, steady drinking that put a distance in his eyes some evenings. He went through a spell when I was about 16, when the calls stopped being every Sunday. Sometimes I wouldn't hear from him for 3 weeks. He always came back. He always apologized. But there was something in him I could never quite reach. Some room with the door closed? I told myself that was just who he was. I met Marcus when I was 28. He was everything I didn't know I was looking for. Steady, funny, a little too serious about craft beer, but otherwise essentially perfect. We got engaged 2 years later on a beach in South Carolina, and I called my father from the parking lot of the restaurant where Marcus and I had dinner to celebrate. I remember sitting in the passenger seat while Marcus drove, my ring catching the streetlights, and my father's voice on the phone saying, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. That's really wonderful." He said it twice. "I'm proud of you. You tell Marcus he'd better be good to you." I laughed. I said, "He will be, Dad." "I know he will," he said. "I know." We set the date for June the following year. A small wedding, 60 people, an outdoor venue about 40 minutes from where I grew up, a reception in a converted barn with string lights and wildflowers. Nothing elaborate, just the people we loved. My father said he would be there. Of course he would be there. He said it more than once, actually. He seemed almost eager about it, which surprised me a little because my father wasn't an eager kind of man. He asked about the venue, asked if there would be parking, asked what time he should arrive. He told me he was going to wear the Navy suit he bought for Danny's college graduation. "The Navy suit," I said. "It still fits," he said, a little defensively, and I laughed. I had no reason to doubt him, not a single one. The morning of my wedding, I woke up at 5:30 without an alarm. The venue had a small cottage on the property where the bridal party got ready. My 2 best friends, Cara and Simone, were there with me. My mother came at 9 with coffee and pastries and cried before she even said good morning. Danny arrived at 10, looking genuinely uncomfortable in his suit, but trying hard. My father was supposed to arrive by noon. The ceremony was at 2. At 12:15, I texted him, "Just checking you're on your way." No response. At 12:40, I called. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His voicemail message was brief, just his name and a request to leave a number. I left a message. I kept my voice light. At 1:15, I called again. Voicemail. I told myself he was driving. I told myself he'd left his phone on silent. I told myself there was a perfectly good explanation. By 1:45, I was standing in my wedding dress, and my father wasn't there, and I didn't have a perfectly good explanation. Marcus's father walked me down the aisle. I don't remember much of the ceremony. I remember Marcus's face. He looked at me like I was the only real thing in the room, and I held on to that. I remember saying my vows and meaning every word and feeling at the same time, like something had been quietly broken inside me. I remember smiling until my face ached. At the reception, Danny pulled me aside and said he'd tried calling Dad too. Nothing. "Should we call the police?" I asked. The words felt strange in my mouth. Danny shook his head slowly. "Let's wait," he said. "He's done this before." He goes quiet. He had done it before. That room with the closed door. I knew that, but not like this. Not on my wedding day. I didn't cry at the reception. I saved that for later, alone in the cottage bathroom, sitting on the cold tile floor in my dress for about 4 minutes before I washed my face and went back out to dance with my husband. My father called 2 days later. It was a Tuesday evening. Marcus and I were still at the hotel where we'd spent our wedding night. We were leaving for our honeymoon Thursday morning. I stepped into the hallway to take the call. "Claire?" His voice sounded strange, thinner than usual. "Dad?" I didn't know what to say first. I was so angry that my hands were shaking. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I can't—" He stopped. "I don't have the words for how sorry I am. Where were you?" My voice was very quiet, which is how I get when I'm truly angry. Not loud, just very, very quiet. "Something happened," he said. "I'll explain. I promise I'll explain everything. I just need a little time." "A little time?" I repeated. "Please." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him what it felt like to walk down that aisle with someone else's father. I wanted to tell him about sitting on the bathroom floor. Instead, I said, "Okay, Dad, call me when you're ready." I hung up and stood in that hotel hallway for a long time. He never called. 47 hours later, my uncle, my father's younger brother Richard, called me to tell me that my father had died in his sleep. Heart attack. They found him in the morning. He was 63 years old. Grief and anger are a terrible combination. They fuel each other. They become something you can't separate, something hot and tangled that lives in your chest and rises without warning. I was grief-stricken because I had lost my father. I was furious because the last time I spoke to him, he owed me an explanation he never gave. That's a hard thing to sit with. I want you to understand that. You can love someone completely and be furious at them at the same time. Both things can be entirely true. Grief doesn't cancel out anger, and anger doesn't cancel out grief. They just exist together in this awful, heavy way that exhausts you. I went through the motions of the funeral. I said the right things. I held it together when I needed to. I accepted casseroles from neighbors and cards from people I barely knew. And privately, quietly, I decided that I knew what had happened. My father had relapsed. That was the explanation I settled on. The drinking, which had been better in his later years, or so I'd believed, had come back. He'd spent the days around my wedding in a blackout, missed the ceremony because he was too drunk to function, called me 2 days later when he'd sobered up enough to be ashamed of himself, and died of a heart attack brought on by years of hard living. It was a painful explanation, but it was a complete one. I held on to it for 5 years. Looking back, I can see the moments I should have questioned it. The first was at the funeral, when Richard pulled me aside and said quietly, Your father talked about your wedding constantly. The last few months, it was all he mentioned. He was so excited. I nodded. I said, "Thank you, Richard." But then he hesitated. Just for a second. A small pause before he changed the subject. He opened his mouth like he was about to say something else, and then stopped himself. His eyes shifted away from mine for just a moment. I noticed it. I filed it away under people say kind things at funerals and moved on. But I kept thinking about that pause. The second was a conversation I had with my father's neighbor, a woman named Bev, who'd lived next door to him for almost 20 years. She came to the repast and found me by the food table and told me my father had been different lately. I asked what she meant. "More settled," she said, like something had finally gotten worked out in him. I don't know how else to say it. He seemed at peace. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she'd seen a woman at my father's house a few times over the past year. Someone Bev didn't recognize. "Came and went at odd hours," Bev said. "Not that it's any of my business." I thanked her. I moved on. But that sat with me differently than the rest of it. The third moment was when Danny and I cleaned out my father's house, about 3 weeks after the funeral. My father was not a sentimental man. He didn't collect things. His house was plain, practical, almost spare. But on his nightstand, there was a framed photograph of me at around age 7, sitting on his shoulders at some county fair, squinting into the sun and grinning. I picked it up and looked at it for a long time. Danny said, from across the room, "He kept that out. Always." I set it down, but I kept thinking about the woman Bev had seen, and about Richard's pause, and about what it means when a man looks like he has finally gotten something sorted, some private decision made, some arrangement locked in, right before he dies. And slowly, quietly, I started building a second theory. What if the drinking hadn't come back at all? What if the real reason he missed my wedding, the reason he was so vague on the phone, so ashamed, so unable to find words, was a woman? A relationship he'd kept hidden, maybe for years. Someone who had complicated that day in a way he couldn't explain to me. Someone he'd been forced to choose between. Someone who, in the end, he had chosen over his own daughter's wedding. I told myself I was being unfair, but once the thought was there, I couldn't undo it. Life moved forward the way it does. Marcus and I built our life. I got promoted twice. We bought a house. We got a dog, a ridiculous, affectionate beagle named Huckleberry who destroys throw pillows for sport. We talked about kids. I thought about my father less as time passed. Not never. He came back to me sometimes unexpectedly, at odd angles. A Sunday evening at 7 o'clock. The smell of the particular coffee he always drank. A man in a navy suit at the grocery store that made my heart do something strange for a second before I blinked and moved on. But I still thought about the woman Bev had mentioned, especially on the bad days, especially when I had too much time to think. About 3 years after the funeral, I called Richard. I don't know exactly what I expected. I just knew there was something in that pause at the funeral, something he'd started to say and then swallowed, and I'd been carrying it long enough. I kept it casual at first, asked how he was doing, how his wife was, and then, almost like an afterthought, "Richard, did Dad ever mention anyone to you? Someone he was seeing, maybe?" There was a silence. "Why are you asking?" he said. Not that I know of. Just, why are you asking?" "Someone saw a woman at his house," I said. "A few times over the last year of his life. I've just wondered." Another pause. Longer this time. And then he said very carefully, "Your father had things in his life he kept private, Claire. I don't think it's my place to—" "Richard." My voice dropped the same way it had on that hotel hallway call with my father. Quiet. Very, very quiet. He missed my wedding. He died 2 days later without ever explaining why. I think I have a right to know. A long exhale. "There was someone," he said finally. "I don't know her name. I never met her. He mentioned her once, maybe twice. That's honestly all I know. Did she have anything to do with the wedding?" "I don't know," he said, and then quieter. "Maybe. I honestly don't know." I thanked him. I hung up. And for the next year, I was more certain than I had ever been about anything. There had been a woman, a relationship my father had kept hidden from all of us, something that had made my wedding day impossible for him, whether from shame or complication or some private disaster I couldn't map. And he had apparently taken the reason to his grave. I was angry in a new way now, a colder way, not the hot, tangled grief anger from right after the funeral. Something more settled, more bitter. I thought, he had a whole life he hid from us. I thought, that's what the closed door actually was. I was sure of it. And then something nagged at me, a small, persistent wrongness I couldn't shake. If there was a woman, a serious relationship, why had Richard only heard of her once, maybe twice? Why had Bev described her as someone she'd seen a few times, not someone who was around regularly? You don't hide an important relationship that thoroughly. Not in a small town where Bev notices everything from her front window. And there was something else I kept circling back to. A period about 2 years before the wedding when my father had seemed unusually stressed. I'd caught it on a few phone calls, a tightness in his voice, a distraction. I'd asked once if everything was okay. He'd said fine, just work things, don't worry. But he'd been retired for 4 years by then. So what was he worried about? I turned it over. A debt maybe. Some financial trouble he'd walked into quietly. That would explain the stress, the secrecy, maybe even the way he'd seemed settled in his final months. Like someone who had made a decision about something and accepted it. Like someone who had gotten something sorted. Or, and this thought arrived suddenly, almost out of nowhere, what if the woman Bev saw wasn't a romantic partner at all? What if she was someone connected to the financial trouble? Someone my father owed something to, or was trying to pay back, or had made some arrangement with that I would never understand. 3 theories, none of them complete, none of them provably wrong, none of them the whole truth. And then, 14 months after we buried him, a box arrived at my door on a Tuesday afternoon in October. There was no return address. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag and then newspaper, was a letter from a woman I had never heard of. Her name was Patricia Hollis. She lived in Columbus, Ohio. She said she had known my father for many years, and she was sorry it had taken her this long to reach out, and she thought I deserved to know some things. And at the bottom of the box, under a layer of tissue paper, were 4 more envelopes and a small leather journal. I sat on my kitchen floor with Huckleberry in my lap, and I read. The first 2 paragraphs of Patricia's letter were professional. Measured. She introduced herself, said how she knew my father, said she was sorry for my loss. And then the 3rd paragraph. She wrote, "Your father and I were very close. He talked about you constantly, about your wedding, about how proud he was. There are things he wanted you to know, and I believe he would have found a way to tell you himself if he'd had more time. I'm reaching out because I was with him in his final year, and I think you deserve the full picture." I put the letter down on the kitchen floor. I was with him in his final year. My first thought was immediate and certain. This is her. This was the woman Bev had seen. This was what Richard had been dancing around. Patricia Hollis, a woman in Columbus, who had been very close to my father, who had been with him during the time leading up to my wedding, who now felt it was her place to send me a box of his private things and tell me he'd wanted me to know the truth. Everything clicked into place. He had been in a relationship he didn't want to complicate by bringing her to the wedding. He was ashamed. He was caught between 2 lives. That's what the stress had been, 2 years before. That's what the settling had been, a decision, finally made. That's why Richard wouldn't look me in the eye. That's why Bev had noticed someone coming and going at odd hours. For a full minute, I sat there on my kitchen floor and thought, okay, now I know. I actually felt a strange calm settle over me, the relief of having a complete answer, even a painful one. I picked the letter back up. I kept reading, and by the 5th paragraph, I understood that I had gotten it completely, catastrophically wrong, again. Patricia Hollis had met my father through a support group, not for alcoholism, though he did attend those meetings too, for years, more consistently than I knew. This was a different group, a grief support group that met at a church in Columbus on Thursday evenings. When she wrote, "I was with him in his final year," she meant she was the person who drove him to his medical appointments, who sat in the waiting room, who helped him navigate paperwork and prescriptions, and the particular loneliness of facing something serious while trying to keep it from the people you love most. She was not a romantic partner. She was something rarer, a person who had known his most hidden grief, who had sat with him in that Thursday evening church room for 8 years, while he learned slowly how to carry it. My father had started attending that group about 8 years before he died. The reason he joined, according to Patricia's letter, was that he was struggling with something he'd never told anyone in our family. He had lost a child before he married my mother, before me, before Danny. Her name was Lily. She had lived for 4 days. My father was 22 years old, unmarried, and his girlfriend at the time, a woman named Susan, had delivered a baby girl 7 weeks early. Lily died of complications the doctors had not been able to prevent. Susan and my father separated not long after. They were too young, and the grief was too large, and they had no idea how to carry it together. My father never spoke of it to anyone for decades. Patricia wrote, "He carried that little girl with him every day of his life. He never stopped. He told me once that he didn't feel he had the right to grieve out loud because he and Susan had never been married, and because he'd been, in his words, barely a father. She only lived 4 days. But I watched that man grieve for 8 years. He grieved for her every single day. I read this 3 times. I sat with it. But here's what I want to be honest about. Reading about Lily cracked something open in me, but it still didn't answer the central question. Why had my father missed the wedding? Carrying old grief, even grief this large, didn't explain that day. Lots of people carry invisible things and still show up, still keep their promises. Something else had kept him away. I picked up the next envelope. The second envelope was from Susan. She had been contacted by Patricia, who had tracked her down through a mutual acquaintance. Susan lived in Arizona now and had a family of her own. She had never forgotten my father, she wrote. She had followed the support group on Facebook and saw Patricia's post when my father passed. And she had kept something she thought I should have. There were 3 photographs in the envelope. The first was a hospital photo, a tiny baby, impossibly small, in a clear plastic bassinet. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, Lily Margaret, June 14th. The second was a young man I almost didn't recognize. He was 22 years old, and he was holding that baby through the plastic of an isolette, his fingers wrapped around her tiny hand, and his face was everything. It was my father. I had never seen my father cry, not once in my entire life. In that photograph, he was weeping openly, without any apparent awareness of the camera. His whole face was undone. The third photograph was taken, Susan wrote, on the last day, the day Lily died. My father was holding her. They had let them hold her, toward the end, and he was looking down at her with an expression I don't have words for. I have seen grief on people's faces before. I thought I knew what it looked like. I didn't know what it looked like that. By this point, I had been on the kitchen floor for 2 hours. Huckleberry had given up and moved to his bed. I had cried without realizing I was crying, just wet cheeks and a tightness in my throat, but I still didn't understand the wedding. I wiped my face. I picked up the journal. It was small and brown, and the cover was creased from years of handling. My father's handwriting, neat, slanted to the right, filled the pages. He'd been keeping it for about a decade. Most of it was quiet, observations, things he was grateful for, notes from his recovery meetings. Sunday evenings he'd called me, conversations he'd had with Danny, small things he wanted to remember. I read it slowly, and then, about 2/3 of the way through, dated about 4 months before my wedding, Claire called today, set the date, June 21st. I will be there. I will not let anything stop me from being there. And a few weeks later, got the results back. Dr. Marsh confirmed, advanced. Options are limited. I don't want to tell the kids. Not before the wedding. I won't ruin this for her. I went very still. I turned the page. I've made peace with most things. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of leaving. There's a difference. I keep thinking about Lily. I keep thinking about what it means to love someone and not be able to stay. I hope she knows. I hope Claire knows. Another entry, 1 month before the wedding. The doctor says the fatigue will get worse. I've started getting the dizzy spells in the mornings. I've made arrangements with Richard just in case. He doesn't know what for. He doesn't need to know yet. I've gotten a suit cleaned, navy. It still fits. I started laughing at that, just for a second, through tears. 2 weeks before the wedding, I'm going, whatever it takes. I'm going to walk her down that aisle, and I'm not going to say a word about any of this, and I'm going to watch her face when she sees Marcus at the end, and I'm going to remember it for as long as I have left to remember anything. I had to put the journal down. I stood up. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard for a while. It was October, the trees turning, the light going flat and golden, the way it does in the afternoon that time of year. My father was dying. He had known for months before my wedding that he was dying, and he had told no one. When I could think clearly again, I picked up the journal and turned to the final entries. 3 days before the wedding. The episode this morning was bad, worse than any so far. Richard found me on the floor. I made him promise not to tell Claire. He doesn't know about the diagnosis. He just thought I'd had a fall. The day before, I can't make the drive. Dr. Marsh said absolutely not. My heart is, the risk is too high. Richard wants me to call Claire. I can't do it. Not today. I can't call her the night before her wedding and tell her this. I can't be the thing that casts a shadow on tomorrow. I will call after. I'll explain after. The day of the wedding, a single line. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. You were the best thing I ever did. And 2 days later, the day he called me, called her today. She was so quiet, so angry. She has every right to be. I wanted to explain, but I couldn't find the words. And then I thought, tomorrow. I'll call tomorrow and I'll find the words. He didn't call tomorrow. He died that night. I sat with all of it for a long time before I called Danny. He came over that night and I showed him everything. Patricia's letter, Susan's photographs, the journal, and we sat at my kitchen table and went through it all together the way we used to do things when we were kids, side by side. Danny is not someone who cries easily. He's built like my father, steady, contained. He cried that night. At some point he said, he didn't want to ruin your wedding. I know, I said. He was dying and he was worried about ruining your wedding. I know. We were quiet for a while. He should have told us, Danny said, not angrily, just as a fact. He should have, I said. But I think for him, that would have meant making it about himself, and he didn't want it to be about him. He wanted it to be about me. Danny rubbed his face with both hands. That's so him? He said. That's so completely, infuriatingly him. I nodded. It was. It was so completely him. Here is the thing about the closed room. I spent years being quietly hurt by it. That part of my father I couldn't reach. The distance in him, the going quiet. I told myself it was the drinking. I told myself it was just his nature. I looked at it from every angle, and I never fully understood it. Now I think I do. He was a man who had lost a child before I was born and never told a soul. A man who had walked around for 40 years with that weight, with that grief he didn't feel he had the right to name out loud. A man who loved his children with everything he had, precisely because he knew what it meant to lose one. The drinking was grief. The going quiet was grief. The closed door was grief. And in the end, in the very end, when he was dying and he could have asked for help, he could have asked for support, he could have leaned on his family the way we would have desperately wanted him to. He closed the door one last time, not to keep us out, to keep the darkness in, because he loved us, because he didn't want to be the shadow over something bright. I am still angry about that, a little. Some days more than others. He should have told us. He should have let us be there for him. He deserved to have people sitting with him who knew what was happening, who could have looked him in the eye and said, I know, and it's okay, and we're here. He didn't let us do that. and I'll spend the rest of my life wishing he had. But I understand now. I finally understand. There's one more thing. In the box, at the very bottom, under the journal and the envelopes, there was one last item I almost missed. A card, the kind you'd find in the wedding section of a drugstore, white with a simple silver border. On the front it said, "For my daughter on her wedding day." He'd signed it the way he always signed things to me. Not love, Dad, not your father. Just, always, Jerry. Inside, in his neat slanted handwriting, "I know this isn't how either of us imagined this day. I'm so sorry. I hope that someday you'll know that I was with you. I was there in every way I knew how to be, even if you couldn't see me. I have watched you become someone extraordinary. I am so proud. I am so grateful. Take good care of each other. That's all that matters in the end. You were the best thing I ever did. Always, Jerry." He wrote it before the wedding. He wrote it knowing he might not make it. He put it in the box that Patricia eventually sent to me because he wanted me to have it, and then he died before he could figure out how to get it to me. I have read it many times now. I've read it on bad days and good days and ordinary days that needed something to make them matter. I've read it so many times, the card is soft at the folds. I think about the man who wrote it, a man carrying 40 years of grief, a diagnosis he kept to himself, a love for his daughter that he didn't know how to say out loud but could apparently put on paper, a man who sat down and wrote those words while he was dying and thought, "She needs to know." He wanted me to know. He was always trying to make sure I knew. He just didn't always know how. I'm not going to tell you that I've made peace with all of it. That would be too neat, too tidy. Real grief doesn't work like that. Real forgiveness doesn't arrive all at once like a package at the door. It comes in pieces, at odd moments, for years. But I'll tell you what I believe now, 5 years on. I believe my father loved me as well as he knew how to love someone, which was imperfectly and quietly and with a great deal left unsaid. I believe he made a decision on my wedding day that came from love, not from failure. I believe he thought he was protecting me. I believe he was wrong to do it that way. I would have wanted to know. I would have wanted to be there for him, but I understand now why he did. I believe he carried Lily with him every day. I believe she made him understand, in a way nothing else could have, how short and precious the time is. I believe that's why he kept that photograph of me on his nightstand. I believe that's why he always called it 7. I believe that's why, on the last day of his life that he could form a thought, he wanted me to know. I wish I had known sooner. I wish he had known how much I loved him. I wish I had said it more, not because I didn't feel it, but because he needed to hear it, and I assumed there would be time. There is almost never as much time as you think. His name was Gerald, but everyone who loved him called him Jerry. And on the last day of his life, before the lights went out, the last thing he wrote in that journal was a single line that I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count. I hope she knows. Dad, I know now. I'm sorry it took me so long.